My name is Max Siegel, and I'm a postdoc in the Tenenbaum lab in the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. So Daniel Kersten is a vision scientist, perhaps best known for his pioneering work in the Bayesian approach to vision. He directs the computational vision group at the University of Minnesota. And Dan was my undergraduate advisor. When I first joined his lab, I didn't know much about him, but I later learned from one of his faculty colleagues that he has changed vision several times. He maintains close ties to MIT. He was an undergraduate here, and he's friends with many faculty. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dan back to visit. Dan, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So first question, Dan, how has the study of vision changed throughout your career?
It's changed tremendously. When I started as a graduate student, most of the people in my field of human vision worked with stimuli that were points of light, sine wave gratings, and there was very little idea of how to proceed to connect the kind of research to everyday perception, recognition of objects, and so forth. A big innovation at the time, a big contribution, was David Marr's book in the 80s. So I finished my PhD in 1983, and that got many of us in the community to begin thinking about how to actually go from natural, realistic image input to making decisions about identities of objects, relationships, and so forth. And thanks in large part to computer vision, which has motivated me and inspired me. The progress in computer vision has lent a lot of ideas that are amenable to testing and expanding our knowledge of the visual brain and how humans and biological vision work.
Well, I mean, as you allude to, computational vision kind of started as a field that studied both human and machine vision, then kind of diverged. Do you see that coming back together?
I would like to see them coming back together, and one of the reasons I enjoy coming to MIT is it's still one of the places where people do try bringing those together. But that's been, I think it's been a challenge. I mean, for example, in computer vision, to get a PhD in computer vision these days, there's just so much to learn, so many techniques, and the goals the applied goals have diverged so much from the goals of trying to relate computation to biological or human vision that I think is real challenging from an educational standpoint. Just how do you train students so that they have enough background and skills in computation, have enough background in the neuroscience at the same time, and in behavior to bring those together. So I would like to see more in that direction in the future, because I think especially human vision and our understanding of the brain, the visual brain, will increasingly necessitate people researchers, young people that can understand the computational aspects.
Do you see any promising avenues for doing that?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think there are a lot of I think benefits to the resurgence of interest in deep learning and neural networks. I mean, we're now in the third and probably biggest phase of enthusiasm. The first phase was in the late 50s, early 60s, and then again in the 80s. And I think that's certainly attracted a lot of young, bright minds to this question of, is this really how the brain works? And the answer is probably not quite. In fact, not by a long shot in many cases. But at least I think it's inspiring a lot of people, so that's good.
Well, you've been one of the main proponents of Bayesian inference and structured models in vision. Nowadays, there's a lot of recent work in unstructured, deep generative models. How do you see that interacting with the more like top-down structured knowledge that you've advocated for?
That I find a tough one. I've been wrestling with that myself, because I mean, various ways of going about it. First of all, I think there's increasing progress in understanding what these unstructured, for example, deep convolutional networks are doing. We're getting a better and better idea of how to think of them. I think a lot of progress is going to come from understanding the relationship between these feed-forward models and implied generative knowledge. And as we gain a better understanding of that, I think then there's a prospect for sort of teasing apart what different layers mean. I do think one of the big challenges, and I know there's ongoing work at MIT that's related, is this question of Alan Ewell my collaborator and I have discussed this problem of semantic accessibility. If you have an unstructured model, it might be very good for recognizing objects, but then there's so many other things the human visual system, the human visual brain can do in terms of accessing, making judgments at very low levels, very flexibly. How do you bridge that?
I mean, one approach that some people advocate is just training nets to do, n tasks and hoping that somehow gets you to arbitrary tasks.
Right. Well, part of the problem is we just don't. My intuition is the range of tasks that we can do is unlimited, and so then you can't train an unlimited number of.
Okay, well,
networks.
maybe this is a good point to ask another question then. Do you think vision is something apart from the rest of the brain?
Well, certainly, you look at the neuroscience, and my main interest has been in primary visual cortex, V1, early visual areas, and there's evidence both in behavior and from the neuroscience that there's a really rich dependency both on other aspects, cognition, on memory. I mean, we see memory effects in as early as V1. Also, I don't think we can totally decouple vision from our environment and environmental constraints, both the physics and natural image statistics. But I think there is a puzzle there, and that is there's certainly evidence that perception, or awareness of what's going on, and perceptual judgments do seem to have some degree of cognitive impenetrability, as it's been called. So you have this rich set of interconnections.
But some of them don't, right?
Some of them don't, yeah. But how would modularity emerge when we've got such a rich degree of interconnectedness across domains? So I think it's a puzzle.
Well, you've worked with a broad range of techniques, computational, psychophysical, and neural. Do you think that they're giving answers that converge in some meaningful way? Or maybe you could give an example of a good phenomenon that you think.
Yeah, I mean, here's a project that we're just beginning to start. This is a collaboration with Alan Ewell and Steve Engel, Sheng Hu, and Cheryl Ullman at the University of Minnesota's. A problem that's interested in computer vision people for a long time, and that's the problem of human pose perception, pose estimation in natural scenes. And from computer vision work, there's a reasonable argument to be made for hierarchical organization of body parts in terms of computing pose. But we also have evidence in fMRI from this kind of hierarchical arrangement where you go from low-level features to parts of bodies to collections to whole bodies eventually. And in fact, some of that work, fMRI work, was done here at MIT. I think there's potential there for connecting. So that's the computation and the neuroscience, but there's also potential to connect it, to relate it to psychophysics. So, for example, we have some ongoing work that shows that there's one can adapt to body part relationships. If you see an forearm that's particularly long, after a while, then a normal arm starts looking short. So I think there's scope certainly for connecting all three domains, and I'm trying to do that right now with this new project. We'll see how it goes.
How do you think vision works?
I thought you weren't going to ask me that.
I ran out of questions.
That's pretty open-ended. To start that and answer that question, you almost have to start at the bottom of the hierarchy of animal complexity, because we've got animals that have extremely simple visual systems, and of course the underlying network still might be very difficult to discern. But you have anywhere from just pure light sensitivity to ability to, track objects and so forth. And so I'm thinking back again, probably because I'm at MIT, I think about historical work done here, like Jerry Letvin's famous paper with what does the frog's eye tell the frog's brain. And so at that very low level, I think we have some good theories that relate to feature detection, their ecological relevance. but it's a big question. And so to get from there to the kind of complex networks that you have, flexible abilities that you have in primates and especially humans, I don't think I can give you a good answer.
Yes.
So I'm just rambling.
Well, maybe a more specific question. I've sometimes heard, and probably you have, that Bayesian approaches to vision, or at least the notion that the brain is doing some kind of Bayesian inference, is like evolutionarily implausible, because how could that evolve?
Well, I think that there's a distinction between at a very abstract level. It depends on your interpretation of Bayes, interpretation of priors, for example. There's a sense in which prior information. How do you learn priors? And the question is, how does the use of priors, how does the use of likelihoods, generative models actually get embedded in an inferential system? And it can be embedded in various ways, because Bayes' formula is it's very abstract. So in the sense, back to the idea of a hierarchical arrangement for object recognition or pose identification, in some sense the priors can be embedded in the architecture itself. And if they're embedded in terms of this representational scheme that's been sort of a working assumption in the field for a long time for object recognition, going back to Fukushima and perhaps earlier, then if you have that kind of representational system, it makes sense that a system would also exploit that for top-down inference, because you've got this structure that's been built there for recognition, but if it's the right structure, then you can use it through feedback to resolve ambiguity. So I think for basic fast recognition, Bayesian tools aren't necessarily that useful, other than to describe the constraints. However, for difficult situations where we have to analyze and resolve ambiguities at a low level, or have to make a decision at a low level that has ambiguous input, then it makes sense to think in terms of generative models, and then you have that likelihood term in the Bayes formula being sort of explicit in terms of an algorithm or mechanism.
It's often assumed that most of the say object recognition that we do is like that fast feed forward.
Right.
Do you think that's plausible? Or how much of everyday vision is not?
Yeah, is not that.
Yeah.
If I had to put a number on it, I think I'd agree that most of everyday vision, we're just walking around doing stuff and not thinking too hard, is like that. On the other hand, to be adaptive over the course of our sort of phylogenetic history, we have to be able to deal with challenging situations that the decision may not always depend upon an instant decision, and but also for learning. If you're dealing with new situations, you need to have. That's another where a Bayesian perspective becomes useful, because you can tune up a system, given camouflage, given low contrast, given any situation where you have really impoverished input, and you still have to make your best guess.
So is that the research philosophy that has underlied your study of camouflage and heavily occluded objects, things like that?
Yeah. I think. We did years ago with Mark Brady. We did these experiments on what we called the bootstrap problem, and that is how do you learn to recognize unfamiliar objects? If you already have a model in your head, you already know what a tiger looks like or some other animal, then given camouflage, you've got a head start in terms of breaking the camouflage. But if you've never seen that particular form before, then it seems like you have a bootstrapping problem, because you don't have the model. Yeah. And so I think, I think that's it's still an interesting problem. I don't think a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of work on that problem. And in general, I think that's an important direction, is this: how do we deal with unfamiliar objects, unfamiliar scenes? Because in a sense, that's what we're born with to some extent.
My last question is, what advice would you give to a young scientist interested in perception?
It would be to study broadly, so study deeply in one area so that you have a high degree of skill in, for example, in computational methods, some or neuroscience, imaging if it's humans, and also behavior methods, to specialize in one of those, but at the same time, don't ignore the breadth of research in perception and vision, and across domains. I think as a graduate student, I was inspired a lot by taking courses in hearing and audition, and so sample broadly, but develop deep skills in at least one area.
Thanks, Dan, for coming to visit.
You're welcome.
I and many others are looking forward to hearing your talk this afternoon.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.